BBC report. It describes an attack that left a scene of utter devastation. So they were led by a Muslim cleric who had attacked the temple in 1997, and the crowd, what did it do? It smashed the walls of the temple with sledgehammers and set fire to it. Pakistani newspaper. Once populated with temples, only traces of Hinduism remain in Laki. Pakistan's crumbling Hindu heritage, our shared culture and responsibility. This is from the New York Times, and there was an advertisement. Sewers wanted only Christians need apply. Why? Because Muslims cannot do the job, and so therefore it is only meant for low-caste Hindus and the Christians who have converted from low-caste Hindus. And remember that Pakistan was founded for protecting Muslims from Hindus, and therefore it is ironical, to say the least, that they would want to come back to a country where they had presumably escaped to make sure that they would not be oppressed by the majority. Namaskar. Good afternoon. Thank you very much to the Sangam Talks for arranging this program, and to you for coming here and spending time this afternoon. The subject is a difficult one. It is technical. So our complaint today, as you can see, is related to a complaint to the United Nations Human Rights Council on the slow but relentless drip genocide of Hindus, Christians and Sikhs in the Islamic Republic of Pakistan. You are seeing a picture of the United Nations Human Rights Council as it is in Geneva, and this is where we are sending our complaint. It has not been sent as yet. We are planning to send it, and we will be also soliciting signatures from those who want to sign the complaint. As this presentation is on a sensitive subject, listeners are strongly advised against any offensive conduct or expressions against any community or person or breaking any law. At the same time, you can consider this as a mix of international law, history, analysis of some religious doctrines, mass psychology, and avenues for advocacy in addressing what lies ahead of us. So, what are we going to talk about today? Briefly, what is a genocide? What is the nature of the complaint, its methodology and scope? Evidence on the physical element, evidence on genocidal intent, concluding arguments, recommendations, vote and discussion. What I would request the members to do is, everyone here, to think that you are members of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And at the end of my presentation, you have to vote to send a resolution to the United Nations Security Council, and you have three choices. You can vote to support the resolution, to oppose the resolution, or you can abstain from it. So therefore, kindly pay close attention to this, because as I said, the subject matter is both technical and difficult and essential. So there is a lot of scholarly ink which has been spilt on what is a genocide, and I will not go into that. But we will restrict ourselves to the definition of genocide, which is given in the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, which was signed in 1948. And this has some specific prohibitions which you cannot do. One is that it defines it as any of the following acts committed with intent to destroy. The word intent to destroy are very important. In whole or in part, the national, ethnic, racial or religious group, such as killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of the group, imposing measures intended to prevent birth, and forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. This, ladies and gentlemen, is a technical definition of genocide as it exists in the 1948 Convention, which I will request you to keep in mind as we go along. When can a genocide occur? The United Nations says that a genocide can occur both in times of war and in times of peace. And that history has shown time and again that genocide is a process, and that throughout this process there are warning signs that mark the road to genocide. In other words, we know before what is coming. Who is accountable? In brief, everybody, whether they are private individuals, whether they are officials, or whether they are rulers, including those having sovereign immunity. In other words, you cannot say that I have a right to commit a genocide because I happen to be a prime minister. So everybody is accountable. This complaint is not Islamophobic. As the UN says, criticism of the ideas, leaders, symbols of Islam is not in itself Islamophobic, and that international human rights law protects individuals and not religions. I am going not by my own personal preferences, ladies and gentlemen, but by what the United Nations says. In terms of the evidence which I will present, the methodology relies on triangulation. In other words, it means that we take evidence from a variety of objective sources so that we arrive at an objective result. And as an Indian, I have deliberately kept myself away from Indian data sources and have relied instead on UN sources, on US sources, on Pakistani sources to enhance the credibility of the complaint. The scope of this is largely restricted to what is now Pakistan. What was earlier West Pakistan and is now Pakistan, with some references to something which has happened in 1971. But of course, a case could have been made that we could have included events up to 1971 because technically that time it was also a part of Pakistan, and therefore we have not, for the sake of brevity. Now let's come to the first aspect. Genocide has two aspects: the physical aspect and the intent aspect. Let's talk about the physical aspect, which means the destruction in whole or in part of a members of any group. Now, what has happened in Pakistan? Has there been a destruction of the minorities? That's the question. Overall, the context is that there has been a massive increase in Pakistan's Muslim population. In fact, they have gone from 33.7 million to 243 million, which is an increase of an astounding 636%. And now, if you read Pakistani media, you will find it full of concerns about how the country can possibly cope with such a gigantic population and its needs when it is acknowledged to be a population with not very many skills. It is known as a demographic giant, and their total fertility rate right now is 3.6, which is far above the replacement rate of 2.1 per woman. But the question is, what has happened to the minorities? Has the population of the minorities increased in the dramatic manner in which the Muslim population is increased? The answer is, for an answer, we turn now to a Pakistani expert, a lady called Farnaz Isfahani, who has written a book called Purifying the Land of the Pure, a history of Pakistan's religious minorities. And what does she say? And if I were to present to you, ladies and gentlemen, members of the UN Human Rights Council, my entire case, it would be this. And I read, I call it a drip genocide because it's the most dangerous kind of wiping out of religious communities. It doesn't happen in one day. It doesn't happen over a few months. Little by little, laws and institutions and bureaucracies and penal codes, textbooks that malign other communities until you come to the point of having this sort of jihadi culture that is running rampant, unquote. And that is a Pakistani author. She further goes on to talk about how there was a healthy mix of minorities at the time of the partition and how it has dramatically decreased. And she says Pakistan goes from 23%, which is almost a quarter of its population, to 3% now. And then she asks a wonderful question. So there has been a purification of minorities. So my big question was, where have they gone? That's what the lady asked, where have they gone? It's a valid question. Another expert, Pakistani expert, as I said, our methodology was to rely on sources which cannot be faulted for their objectivity, is Aisha Siddiqui. And she too talks about the non-Muslim population being around 24.7. Very soon the conditions changed and came down to 5%. And then she makes this startling prognosis. And if conditions do not change, even this percentage will disappear. Another Pakistani author. The New York Times basically tells the same thing. The story of the reduction of the minority population of Pakistan. 24.5% in the areas that now form Pakistan. So therefore I'm excluding the areas in erstwhile East Pakistan. The percentage shrank rapidly. By 1998, the last government census to classify people by religion, Hindus were just 1.6%. Most estimates say it is further dwindled in the past 2 decades. The New York Times. The Voice of America. Again, the same thing. Hindu population significantly decreased, with many migrating to India to seek refuge status, citing religious persecution in Pakistan. They have long complained of prejudice against them, both from the government and society. That's important because it is the atmosphere which surrounds the minorities which is an important evidence on this matter. The Dawn, Pakistani newspaper, which I read every day, which is quite an interesting newspaper. It's a high quality newspaper and I recommend you read it because we must, knowledge is power. So you have to, I read Dawn every day to find out what's going on in their mind. Sometimes I agree and sometimes I don't. Some of the articles are very, very good, right? So what does the Dawn say? Religious minorities have been made invisible in our electoral politics. Many are scared of a public discussion on the issue of Pakistan minorities. Now, I have not deliberately given the numbers of Hindus out there because we don't know. So all I have pointed out is that triangulated evidence from various sources which I've just shown, including Pakistani sources, shows there has been a dramatic decline in the numbers of minorities as opposed to the Pakistani population, which has dramatically ballooned. Hence, if you look at the first part of the technical requirement of a genocide, that stands satisfied for the simple reason there has been a destruction, not in whole, but certainly in part. Not in whole, but certainly in part, right? Now, let's come to the second trickier question of genocidal intent. And genocidal intent, I have given before you a quotation from the International Court of Justice, from the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And that is what it says. It says, in the absence of confession, genocidal intent can be proven with circumstantial evidence, right? Especially the scale of the atrocities committed, the general nature in a region or a country, or furthermore, the fact of deliberately and systematically targeting victims on account of their membership of a particular group. Naturally, that would include the membership of a religious group. So this is the test which is laid down by the 3 international tribunals, including the International Court of Justice. Let's go ahead further, because we need to understand that our thinking has to be based on some norms which are objective. So it's not me who thinks that. I'm basing my thinking and conclusions on some objective norms. And here is one, normative guidance from the United Nations, where they have a framework of analysis for atrocity crimes. Genocide is an atrocity crime, in which they say, it says you've got to find out the reasons, the aims and the drivers that justify the use of violence against protected groups. In other words, the people who are committing the violence are committing it for some reason inside their mind. There is a justification. They think they're doing the right thing to their mind. Now, what is that? Right? Then the UN guidance says, indicator 4.7 requires considering ideologies based on the supremacy of a certain identity or extremist versions of identity. So therefore, this seeks to answer what drove the people to commit the genocide. That's the question. Now, when you are doing an evidence-based analysis, I looked at the United Nations documents, and what do you find there? That Islam is mentioned in UN documents that refer to the plight of minorities in Pakistan. And I'll give you some examples. References to Islam in UN documents. UN experts in April 2024. Christian and Hindu girls remain particularly vulnerable to forced religious conversion, abduction, trafficking, child and early forced marriage, domestic servitude, and sexual violence. UN experts in 2023. Girls as young as 13, which is technically a child under international law, are forced to marry and convert to Islam. Mexico recommended to Pakistan that it should adopt all measures to eradicate the forced conversion to Islam of women and girls belonging to religious minorities. Again, 2022, special rapporteurs talking about forcible marriage and converting to Islam. And UK and Northern Ireland recommended that Pakistan ensure that minorities can access suitable alternatives to compulsory Quranic studies. In other words, minorities were being subjected to compulsory Quranic studies. That is the only implication. But that doesn't, the UN documents don't answer the question, what is it in this religious ideology which is making them behave in a certain way? And for an answer to that, we again turn to Pakistani experts, right? Pakistani and international experts. The first is a concept called dawa. Now, what is dawa? Dawa is an Arabic term largely understood to signify an invitation to Islam. Converting Muslims to Islam is considered a meritorious activity. Ayn Hirsi Ali, a brave Somali lady who is now in the United States and she is under threat of radicals, says that dawa is a process of methodical indoctrination, brainwashing that rejects assimilation. Another source of information, unbiased information in this, is a fascinating book which I'm reading right now. It's called Faith-Based Violence and Deobandi Militancy in Pakistan. And if you read, there is an author in this called Pervez Hoodbhoy. I think some of you might have heard of him. He's a very famous guy. And he has a chapter in this book and says, could Pakistan have remained pluralistic? With the obvious implication that it is not pluralistic right now. And then he says, he refers to the concept of jizya, penalty, zimmi, non-Muslim, and but shikini, destruction of idols, and says, without their explicit rejection, pluralism is impossible to achieve within a state that purports to be run by Quranic principles, unquote. He then refers to a conservative Muslim cleric who says, jizya is a symbol of humiliation and submission because zimmis should not be regarded as full-fledged citizens of the Islamic State, even if they are natives of the country. They are not allowed to build new churches, temples, or synagogues, yet Muslims, if they wish, are permitted to demolish all Muslim houses of worship in any land they conquer, unquote. This is Pervez Hoodbhoy, and this book can be read by anybody. In the same book, two authors on the status of Christians in Pakistan write as follows. They say the chapter is entitled Marked by the Cross, the persecution of Christians in Pakistan, also refer to the Islamic or Arabic notion of dhimmi, an unbeliever who pays the jizya tax and accepts lower status in an Islamic society for the privilege of living there and following their own religion. That is the technical definition of a dhimmi, according to Pakistani experts. They also write, the ones who are writing on Christians, they say there are inequalities with regard to taxes, refusal to accept the testimony. Dhimmi also means that they accept subjugation, they are allowed to reside in a Muslim country despite the fact that they are unbelievers. This book also refers to kafirs, which is translated as unbelievers, which literally means an unbeliever, and according to Surah 98.6, they are the worst of created beings. He also, Pervez Hoodboy, also refers in this article to two surahs, 8.36, which is war on idolaters until and God's religion reigns supreme, and 9.29, fighting those who do not believe in Allah or the last day until they give jizya willingly while they are humbled. Then he makes certain statements which have astonishing relevance for the world at large. And he says no arguments from outside Islam have validity because as a faith, Islam is a set of immutable principles that does not need compatibility with anything other than itself. In other words, asserting that any dialogue with Islam is impossible if you simply take the logical conclusion of what he says. And he also says that textually and formally, literalist Islam does not permit any real degree of integration of non-Muslims into a Muslim society, that Muslims frequently live together peacefully with other religious communities should not be confused with this fact. In other words, when Muslims live peacefully with others, it is not because of Islam but despite it, and that they are violating Islam, because practice and theology is different. Now, having had a look at some of the reasons behind this irrelevant, we also need to look at the fact as to what is going on in the history of Pakistan. And here we talk about the historical roots. Again, keeping true to our methodology of consulting Pakistani authors, I have put a quotation by a Pakistani expert, Ishtiaq Ahmed, and he says, "We were born because of hatred. We are alive because of hatred. This hatred was for Indians and Hindus. The hatred was for Bengalis. Now we hate the Baluch. With Iranis also there is hatred. How can we become a normal state?" Unquote. A Pakistani expert who is now in Sweden. You can listen to him, he's quite popular. Coming back to the Islamic impulse behind the genocide, we again turn to Farnaz Isfahani, who has written this book called Purifying the Land of the Pure. And she says, normally when people talk about genocide, they talk about Nazi Germany or Yugoslavia. In the case of Pakistan, this is a slow genocide, drip, drip, drip over 76 years. And then she goes on to make an authoritative statement. She says, as the author of the book on the history of Pakistan's religious minorities, let me state clearly that the real culprit in the widespread persecution of religious minorities in the state of Pakistan was the desire of some to create a purer Islamic state. So she is identifying the cause behind it. And then she says, what I've uncovered is quite devastating because it was not some particular ruler who has made it. It is not Zia-ul Haq. She says, it is right from the beginning. It has been done from the time of Mr. Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the Quaid-e-Azam of Pakistan. As he lay dying, already the political and bureaucratic wheels were moving towards a more Muslim state. That is, she is situating this genocide, which she calls a drip, drip genocide, right at the very beginning and inception of Pakistan. And again, it's a wonderful, statement, which it's the most dangerous kind of wiping out of religious communities. And I have read this earlier. It doesn't happen in one day. It happens slowly until you have the jihadi culture that is running rampant. And then she goes on to describe the 4 stages of genocide according to her. One is Muslimization between 1945 and 1951. Second is Muslim identity from 1958. with state-sponsored textbooks that rejected pluralism and painted religious minorities very negatively. Third stage was Muslimization during President Zia-ul Haq's time that created a legal framework against minorities. And lastly, you have the militant hostility towards minorities, including terrorism and organized religion. Now, we cannot obviously ignore the role of Muhammad Ali Jinnah in this, because he had a very specific and a very intolerant vision which everybody knows about. The intent to commit genocide flows directly from the two-nation theory declared by Pakistan, who said it is a dream that Hindus and Muslims can ever evolve a common nationality. And then perhaps you might have read his famous 11th August 1947 speech, which is portrayed as the genuine Jinnah, in which he wanted Pakistan to become a secular state. You are free to go to your mosques, you are free to go to your temples, and there is a general lamentation in the international media that, alas, if Pakistan had only adhered to this vision of Jinnah, everything would have been okay. But Pakistani commentators have pushed back on that. And they have said, Jinnah made several thousand speeches, from 1908 to 1948, and there is not a single speech in which he has said anything in favor of secularism. On the contrary, there are 200 speeches expressing his Islamic orientation. And these speeches contradicting secularism were made both before and after the 11th August 1947 speech, and therefore it would be unreasonable and illogical to give an interpretation in favor of secularism in a speech of 11th August 1947. An interesting thing, I was looking at the website of the Jinnah Institute before I came, and it talks about pluralism, peace. There is no mention of Islam there, which I found very strange, considering the fact that he had founded a state based on Islam. Pervez Hoodbhoy also says, in a broadcast address to the people of the USA in February 1948, he described Pakistan as a premier Islamic state. So therefore, his vision, obviously, since he is an important person, infected the birth and the development and the evolution of the country's psychology. And the evidence for that is that there were supremacist Islamic slogans which were made during the creation of Pakistan. And according to Pakistani media, the most influential piece of poetry written in Pakistan were the words, Pakistan ka matlab kya, la ilaha illallah, and it says it shaped the country's ideology. In other words, it was an exclusivist Islamic vision in which poetry was also put into operation. Other slogans included Muslim hai to Muslim League mein aa, or Pakistan mein Musalmanon ki hukumat hogi. Again, this is nothing but supremacism. We go on to another document which is called the Objectives Resolution 1948, which declared that the entire sovereignty belongs to Allah and that it should be delegated to state through its people by the rules set by Allah. And although there were Hindu members of the Constituent Assembly at that time, and they had objections, they were overruled at that time. This is a part of the historical record. We come to the Nehru-Liaquat Agreement, in which it was expressly agreed that there would be no forcible conversions. Now, obviously, forcible conversions occur only on the behalf of Muslims, because in Hinduism, you're born into Hindu. You cannot forcibly convert anyone into Hinduism, in which this was plainly violated, and Pakistan did not protect its minorities as was agreed in this document. In 1963, Jawaharlal Nehru's sister Vijay Lakshmi Pandit called attention to this in the United Nations. That said, the government of Pakistan ever since its creation has followed a communal policy based on the pernicious two-nation theory. Hindus from West Pakistan have already been practically eliminated. So the evidence which I'm trying to show is the the fast disappearance of Hindus from Pakistan as attested to by contemporary records. The genocide in the Pakistani Civil War, which gave rise to the creation of Bangladesh, I'm sure you know about it. Hindus were targeted mercilessly. They were targeted because they were Hindus, and there are contemporaneous documents which attest to this, including a very famous consul of the US, Arthur Blood. He was posted in Dhaka at that time, and he sent this thing called the Blood Telegram, warning of the genocide which was being carried out to the State Department, which was ignored for various reasons, because Nixon didn't like Indira Gandhi, and they were more pally with the Pakistan. He was more pally with the Pakistanis. So in that sense, this was a contemporaneous evidence by the United States. Similarly, we have US Senator Edward Kennedy, in which he says they were mercilessly slaughtered, and in some places they were planted the yellow patches marked H. So therefore they were deliberately targeted because they were Hindus, which is forbidden by the Genocide Convention, as I said right at the beginning. Now, we've taken a tour of what is genocide, what are the impulse behind the genocide. We've had a look at the reduction in the population. We've had a look at the history. But now we come to the present day. Now, today. So the prohibitions under the Genocide Convention include that you can't impose measures intended to prevent birth within the group. But if you convert a woman from one religion to Islam, she cannot give birth to the religion which she has left behind. So therefore, this is a direct contradiction of what the Genocide Convention says, to prevent births within a group. And once forcibly converted, they cannot contribute to that community. Now, the facts and figures of this, again, are quite clear, and from a variety of sources we find out about 1,000 Hindu girls and Christian girls are converted. They are forced to convert and marry their kidnappers. Fanatical mullahs are at the forefront, supported and enabled by the whole of Pakistani society in various ways. Again, what the UN experts said, Hindu and Christian girls remain particularly vulnerable to forced religious conversion, abduction, trafficking, child and early forced marriage, domestic servitude, and sexual violence. This evidence cannot be challenged because this is from the United Nations. And then they said, the exposure of young girls and women belonging to religious minorities and the impunity of such crimes can no longer be tolerated or justified. You cannot have a clearer statement of violation and of their condition there. The United States Commission on International Religious Freedom also said words similarly to that effect. That is, accusations of blasphemy, targeted killings, lynchings, mob violence, forced conversion, sexual violence against women and girls, desecration of houses of worship and cemeteries, continued threat of persecution by harsh and discriminatory legislation. An example. Now, this example is from Dawn, the Pakistani newspaper. And they talk about a young girl called Priya Kumari. She disappeared. And she disappeared when her father, we have to call it a syncretist Hindu, he was distributing sharbat to to Muslim mourners. So she disappeared. And they said that it's a curious case. For one, she disappeared from a place that was thronged with hundreds of people, yet reportedly the police found little by way of evidence or even a witness. Now, why no witness? Why no witness? Because there is silence on behalf of the community when things like that occur. Nobody has stepped forward to say, I saw this little girl being taken away. There is complete silence. There is complicity. There is no other way when one can draw any other conclusion except for the fact that there is either complete indifference or there is tacit approval of this kind of acts. So Dawn found fault with the incapacity, dysfunctionality, discomfiture of the entire criminal justice system, the law, the police, investigation, persecution, adjudication. In other words, the little girl has absolutely no chance when you have the entire state machinery decked against her. And not only that, even the society. And then, are there any efforts to improve the situation? People have tried, have failed. Again, a Pakistani newspaper reported, last week in a shameful capitulation to religious fanatics, the Pakistan People's Party rejected a proposed bill in the Sindh Assembly against forced conversions. And then, the paper says, What religious freedom means is currently what the fanatic believes it should mean. Now, we come to another very insidious and very dangerous aspect, and that is what is taught in schools. It is very important because children have plastic minds. The value, which is the values and the thoughts and the worldview and the facts which are implanted in their brains when they're young, carry on with them for the rest of their lives. So let's see what is taught in Pakistani textbooks according to, again, independent sources. A seminar in Peshawar concluded the school curriculum has fomented hatred against the minorities of the country. The Sikh leader attending the event, Sardar Charanjit Singh, said, minorities are treated like stepchildren and ignored on every platform. There was a study which was of 100 textbooks in grades 1 to 10, which was conducted, and this is what they found, that is prejudice and intolerance of Hindus and other religious minorities. Most teachers believed that non-Muslims are enemies of Islam, that religious minorities are portrayed as inferior or second-grade citizens who have been granted limited rights and privileges by generous Pakistanis for which they should be grateful. Hindus are repeatedly described as extremists whose culture and society is based on injustice and cruelty, while Islam delivers a message of peace and brotherhood, concepts portrayed as alien to the Hindu. Historic revisionism seems designed to exonerate or glorify Islamic civilization and to denigrate the civilizations of religious minorities. Islamic teachings and references are commonplace in compulsory textbooks, not just religious ones, meaning Pakistan's Christians, Hindus, and other minorities were being taught Islamic content. This is the result of an empirically based study of 100 textbooks in all the 4 provinces of Pakistan. Now, what is taught in school curriculums is never an accident. School curriculums have to be decided very carefully. They have to be written. Every word is weighed. What goes in and what goes out is important. Once they are written, then they have to be given to authorities to approve them. And they have to be finally signed off by political authorities. So when you have textbooks which demonstrate such a lot of virulence against the minorities, it is not unreasonable to conclude that the entire power structure is aware of this and approves of this mainstreaming of hatred in people's minds. After having sown hatred, after having taken away the women, it continues. And that is attacks and the neglect of Hindu temples and churches. The BBC. Hindu shrine desecration, can Pakistan protects its religious minorities? BBC report. It describes an attack that left a scene of utter devastation. So they were led by a Muslim cleric who had attacked the temple in 1997, and the crowd, what did it do? It smashed the walls of the temple with sledgehammers and set fire to it. Pakistani newspaper. Once populated with temples, only traces of Hinduism remain in Laki. Pakistani newspaper. Pakistan's crumbling Hindu heritage, our shared culture and responsibility. Now here's a very interesting thing. There is a small section of liberal Pakistanis who are not very happy at this development and consequently try to fight for the minorities. I salute them. I salute them obviously, but at the same time it's a small sliver of people who do that. Dawn often speaks on behalf of the minorities, but the fact is that these are the slight liberals who are left in Pakistan who understand that destruction of the Hindu temples is in fact a destruction of part of the country's history. Amnesty International, again talking about the rights of Hindus, and it says at the bottom, it says, authorities in Islamabad capitulated to pressure from a discriminatory campaign mounted by politicians, media outlets and clerics to halt the construction of a rare temple in Pakistan's capital. The boundary wall of the site of the temple was supposed to be constructed has been torn down by a mob. Now remember, in the earlier slide, I told you what Parvez Hudwa had said, that Dhimmis are not allowed to construct churches or temples, and if they construct them, then they can be torn down. So this is an example of that concept of Dhimmi being put into operation by the people. So what I want you to think is to observe what is going on the ground and then work your way backwards to the concept which explains the reasons for why these people are acting so, in a manner which violates the Genocide Convention. That is the method of thinking which I want you to think about without any hatred, but simply as an objective means. Again, Times of India, one of the few rare Indian sources which I've taken. Pakistani temple abolished and attacked with rockets. Attacked with rockets. The plight of Christians in Pakistan. Christians are 2%, 3 million, and most of them live in sheer poverty doing menial jobs. And Christians in general are referred to by the insulting term of musalli, which means immoral, low caste, and polluted. And I have taken this from the same book, written by the Pakistani authors. And what do they say? This book says, Christians in Pakistan are victims of persecution, mob violence resulting in injury, death, burning and killing of individuals, shooting during church services, rape, sexual abuse, kidnappings, and forced conversions are some of the atrocities experienced by Christians in current day Pakistan. Attacks on churches. So they attacked 26 churches at one time. There was a rumor that a page in the Quran had got burned, and then there was a mob-like behavior in which they came from many villages, all on different. Some came on tractors, on cars, on motorcycles, and this is what they say. As they advanced towards the town, they methodically sought and targeted churches in every village they passed, no matter how small or densely located. So what did they do? They raided the valuables, desecrated crosses, burned the Bibles, and in some cases they employed cranes to pull out church barriers. They employed cranes to pull out church barriers, just imagine. The plight of Sikhs. Again, many of them have fled. Violent attacks including targeted killings, abduction, extortion, forced conversions to Islam, and forced marriages pose a major threat to the Sikh community in Pakistan. The growing intolerance of religious diversity has forced many Sikhs to migrate to other countries in search of safety and freedom to practice their faith without fear. It doesn't end there. We come to social apartheid. Now, this is from the New York Times, and there was an advertisement. Sewers wanted only Christians need apply. Why? Because Muslims cannot do the job, and so therefore it is only meant for low caste Hindus and the Christians who have converted from low caste Hindus. And this is a very interesting thing. There's this book which I was reading called Empires of the Indus, written by a lady called Alice Albania. And this gives how social apartheid was practiced right from the very beginning of Pakistan. So what happened was that in 1948, after partition, the depressed classes, the Christians and the Hindus, they started leaving Karachi. Now they were the ones who were responsible for the cleanliness of Karachi. And once they left, they said Karachi was the cleanest city in Pakistan and it experienced a sanitary crisis. So the government of Sindh took legal action to stop them, and then she writes, the Indian ambassador to Pakistan, horrified at the action, scheduled a meeting with the Prime Minister to complain. Surely God did not create the Hindus to clean the roads and latrines of Pakistan. And the reply was, but who, the Prime Minister replied, would clean the streets and latrines of Karachi in case they did not come back? And then the writer says, in Pakistan, the attitude of the ruling class appeared to be that huge swaths of its population were second-class citizens. Job discrimination. Again, as I said, they deliberately try to keep these jobs only for Christians and low-caste Hindus. And there was an advertisement in Pakistan, in the Pakistani army. They said, non-Muslims only apply in the non-combatant category that included tailor, carpenter, painter, bootmaker, water carrier, and sanitary workers. So an activist posted on Twitter, so the criteria for sweeper sanitary worker in Pakistan should be non-Muslims only. Your job is to make filth and ours is to clean only. So there was a pushback. De facto slavery for Hindus and Christians. They are overly represented in brick kilns in which they live in de facto slavery. They're also targeted by criminals because of their faith. And again, this is the US International Report. They say Hindus were kidnapped at higher rates because they were excluded from local patronage and protection networks run by police and powerful landlords. Again, I come back to the concept of dhimmi. They were converted after they received no assistance after heavy floods. In 2022, if you remember, there were very heavy floods in Pakistan. And they had wanted to go all over asking for a lot of money for the floods. And then they converted 100 bheels. Why? Because they were not getting assistance because they were Hindus. And it says, influential local politicians and religious leaders offered Hindus food and financial assistance for converting, as most received no flood assistance from authorities and faced discrimination in relief and rehabilitation activities. Now just imagine, you have people literally, dying, and then you are giving aid, and the person before you happens to be a person of a different religion, and then you say, sorry, I'm not going to give it to you. Now, this conversion, do you think it has anything to do with God, or it is a fraudulent act? And I think that the persons do this are seriously ethically challenged, in my opinion. Poor and desperate Pakistani Hindus accept Islam to get by. Forcible evictions because of their faith. Now churches, temples, gurdwaras, they also have land around their gurdwaras. So therefore, they're also land mafias, real estate developers. They try to grab that land in cahoots with the authorities. So the situation, ladies and gentlemen, is so bad in Pakistan that there are UN experts called UN rapporteurs. So in 2022, special rapporteurs, now each one of them deals with a separate subject. So the ones who deal with contemporary forms of slavery, minority issues, freedom of religion or belief, the sale and exploitation of children, trafficking in persons, especially women and girls, violence against women, and the Working Group of Discrimination Against Women and Girls, all of them wrote a joint and open letter to the Pakistani Prime Minister. They would not have done so unless the human rights situation in Pakistan was very grave. So, now let's come to, I've presented the evidence to you, and I would like to give my concluding arguments based upon the Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, which I told you right at the beginning, and all the prohibitions that it has inside. We know for a fact that there has been a steep decline in the percentage of Hindus, Sikhs, and Christians, contrasted with the massive rise in Muslim population. In other words, one condition, that is the destruction in whole or in part of a group based upon their status or their religion, is satisfied. It has and continues to be a drip genocide, as pointed out by a Pakistani expert herself. Not us, herself. The real culprit in the widespread persecution of religious minorities in the case of Pakistan was a desire of some to create a purer Islamic state. Again, not my words, the words of a Pakistani scholar. The desire for a purer Islamic state meant that dhimmis had to be converted and discriminated against. It was manifested in the hatred during the movement to create Pakistan, and this hatred was operationalized within the state structure and mainstreamed into society by paranoid, inaccurate, and supremacist textbooks. We saw what the textbooks teach. Since 1947, the state of Pakistan, created in the name of Islam, has kidnapped, killed, raped, sexually abused, falsely accused, imprisoned, illegally converted, discriminated against its Hindus, Christians, Sikh minorities, with women and girls being their preferred targets. Their temples and churches, gurdwaras, have been burnt, bombed, vandalized, and destroyed, and their properties snatched and illegally expropriated. Violent mobs have rained terror on them. The laws supposedly protecting them have proved meaningless, as unenforced laws are worse than no laws at all. They have been subjected to grievous and continuous violation only because they fell into the wrong and fundamental classification of Islam. As kafirs, they could only live as dhimmis. They were targeted only because of their faith. Now, So therefore, based upon this evidence, I submit to you that the evidence demonstrates that Pakistan's continuing acts constitute genocide under Article 2 of the Genocide Convention and fulfill the requirements of the intent to destroy as laid down by the International Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, and the International Court of Justice. So, to that end, we make the following recommendations. One is that the Security Council should mandate an International Criminal Tribunal for Pakistan for the period starting from 12 January till the present day, to identify, prosecute politicians, high-ranking civil, military, and government officials, businessmen, as well as religious leaders, militia, media leaders, private individuals, all responsible for the genocide of Pakistan Hindus, Christians, and Sikhs. To ensure a complete cessation of the violation of human rights of Hindus, Christians, and Sikhs as evidenced above. To require UN human rights and women to closely support the work of the tribunal, including through field visits in Pakistan for fact-finding to prevent any further and fraudulent conversions of Hindus, Christians, and Sikh women to Islam. To instruct the Pakistani government immediately to confiscate all textbooks that teach hatred of Pakistan's Hindu, Christian, and Sikh minorities, and to decide upon a mechanism for monetary compensation for the victims of genocide exclusively funded by the government of Pakistan. And finally, we have said that there should be a re-examination of the concept of genocide, which one personally thinks as a sudden act of violence, but as we have seen in this case, is an extended act, and consequently the historical experience and the definition of genocide needs to be updated. So, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my presentation. And as I said right at the very beginning, you are members of the United Nations Human Rights Council. And you now have to vote, 47 of you, that based upon this evidence, you have to vote on a resolution. Do you support the resolution to send this complaint to the Security Council? Do you oppose it, or do you abstain it? Do you abstain? The vote is yours. I'm sorry? Support. Okay. Great. Everybody who supports, could you please raise their hands?
Can I raise two hands?
Right. So, anybody who opposes, could you kindly raise your hands, please? And anybody who abstains? So that was it. That was it. Basically, I hope that it was not too long. As I said, it was a technical subject. I thank you for your patience. I thank you for your understanding. And we can take some questions.
Yes, sir.
We can take some questions.
Sir, your speech your presentation was very nice, and it has really raised a lot of, we already knew about some of it, but not in so much detail. See, my point is that we want to send, UN peacekeeping or, whatever, against this genocide in Pakistan. We want to send these recommendations. But do you think they are going to follow it? In India itself, let me complete. We cannot do anything sitting in India. We are in fact letting the Muslims proliferate and increase their numbers, and we are not doing anything about it. We are forgetting all the conventions which were signed in the past. We are letting them prosper and dominate us, forget about anything of that sort. So I think all this, it doesn't really help.
Yeah.
Look at the UN, they are so helpless. They cannot stop this Ukraine and Russia war.
Yeah.
They cannot stop the Israel and Hamas war. So what do you think they are going to do in Pakistan?
So thank you for that very pertinent and very basic and fundamental question. The answer is they are going to do nothing. Okay? The idea is not to expect anything from them. The idea is to make a noise. That's what it is. So therefore, in this complaint, which we have not yet sent, we will be asking if anybody wants to, sign the complaint. You're more than welcome, and I think the organizers of this event can, take the names and signatures, because you're going to send it to them. But the narrative is important. Raising your voice is important, because if you don't fight for yourself, who is going to fight for you? So therefore, we had earlier given a complaint to the United Nations on how Sharia violates the human rights of women, including Muslim women. They did nothing. So therefore, I fully share your certainty that they will do nothing, but we cannot do nothing. That is, inaction is not an option for us. So therefore, that is my answer to you. Yes, please.
What the lady has said is very right. However, my thing is, if whatever you have made, it comes in the Indian media,
Right.
the Indian Muslims will also start thinking a little,
Yes.
maybe a little, but they will start thinking process. That is important. That's what I think.
So, thank you, sir. So that's what it is, that once we file this complaint, it should be publicized in the Indian media. And you are the agents. Everybody who signs the complaint, consider it your complaint. Make a noise about it. Talk about it. So that's the reason. You know, we spent like almost like 6 months writing this complaint, right? It's a 66-page complaint. But inaction is not an option. Let's be very clear about this. So, after I retired from the IPS, I've served many places in the UN, and the thing is that there's a certain amount of information which has come because of the fact that I did all these jobs. That is of no use to me, but it is used to society. But it is also used to society. Everybody else steps up, so therefore we have to act together.
Just wanted to give you some feedbacks with reference to all the crimes that you have mentioned. So there is something called transnational organized crime,
Yeah.
and I have already filed the case in 2016 at the Supreme Court of India itself.
Right.
Last year, not last year, 2 months ago, I have made UN as the party in the case as well, because they've been favoring Pakistan a lot at the conventions in Vienna.
Mm-hmm.
All the crimes that you've mentioned, it's been tagged under human smuggling,
Correct.
which is not a term in India whatsoever. At the same time, they had filed an intervention. The UN had filed an intervention under CAA with the Supreme Court.
Right.
So I've used the same aspect for making them as a respondent in our case. And I believe it would be really good that if you, before filing with the human rights, you file it with the Supreme Court of India itself, by making them as a party, because when they can interfere in Indian matters, specifically when it comes to CAA, and this being one of the core aspect of it, we have also been adding them. I had named them in the Bombay High Court case as well. There's another segment of genocide through dairy industry, but the court has dismissed, but I'll be taking it further. Yes, sorry. Sure. No, it's just that the feedback is important, because when we are getting into the signing of the complaint, it should not just be with the UN, but also with the Indian authorities, because the buzz has to be on those lines. So in case that complaint copy, I can get it as well, I will be more than happy to take it from my end as well.
Yeah.
Because these crimes have been tagged under UN ODC more than in the human rights segment of the UN, because it falls under the crime and drug segment.
We're going to give a copy of this complaint to the US, to UK, to France, to Pakistan. Obviously, it'll go to them, and also to India, our Prime Minister, through our permanent mission in India. A hard copy. So we can certainly talk about who else to copy in that, but it's going to be given to the Indian authorities, obviously.
Sir, my question is a practical one.
Right.
Now, all the points that you mentioned
Uh-huh.
about the genocide which is happening in Pakistan is actually according to their foundational principles, if I'm not wrong.
Correct.
Because they are founded on the basis of Islam, which, in a sense, actually says that this should be done, the kafir should be killed, kafir should be converted, etc., etc. So now, even if we make a noise about this resolution, how far is it likely to go? Because that's the foundational principles of a nation. So how can the UN interfere, if I may ask, I'm humbly asking this question, in the foundational principles of a nation, that this is us, we are Islamic, this is what we do, this is Sharia, ये हम यही करते हैं, so how can this go across? That is one point. And secondly, since we are all together on this, can we also include the need for us to have the CAA which has been so, widely criticized by various segments, fought by Muslim groups, and so on in India, that this is what necessitates the need for CAA so that we can bring our people in India to things.
Thank you. Both questions are very relevant. The first question is that when you're talking about a country saying that these are our foundational principles and that we are going to do what our foundational principles say, you have to go further than simply accepting this argument at face value. And what do I mean by that? That again, the way I would request everybody to start thinking is to ask yourself the question, what is the objective norm in this situation which I can base my argument on without being accused of any hatred? Now, for instance, if they say, well, we have a right to kill people based upon that's not going to fly, because there is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the answer to that is that this is in violation of the international laws, of which there are plenty. There are plenty. The complaint which we had given, and I can give that complaint out, on the violation of women's human rights by Sharia, the multiple marriages, the divorces, not the divorce, the female genital mutilation, the institutionalized and legalized discrimination against women in Sharia, all that falls foul of plenty of aspects of international law. So when you are confronted with the answer, you say, oh, well, it is our law, that argument is not valid. And your response should be, it's not valid because it is contrary to international law and national law, so therefore only one can prevail, and it is international law which has to prevail. So that's what it is. Number two, in terms of CAA, well, that is the reason why CAA was necessary out here. It's a horrific condition. Actually, I was just in Jaipur, and I was talking to Hindus out there, a gentleman who looks after Hindus who had come from Pakistan, and the fact of the matter is that they're all really, really dying to get out of their place, and that's why CAA was put into operation. So this can also be used as evidence of the necessity and the vigorous implementation of CAA. That's what I'm saying. So two answers to you. One, do not accept that at face value. Resort to the laws which are accepted. And two, certainly it can be used to strengthen the argument for the CAA. Does that answer your question? Thank you. So the thing is that we have to expect the worst from them, and we have to put our foot forward, because the fight cannot go without a fight. You see, there are two sides to it. And remember that Pakistan was founded for protecting Muslims from Hindus, and therefore it is ironical, to say the least, that they would want to come back to a country where they had presumably escaped to make sure that they would not be oppressed by the majority. So therefore, it was the 1950 Nehru-Liaquat Agreement was for the minorities. It was not for the Muslims. They got their country. They got their country. That's what it is. And what is happening in Bangladesh is another matter of concern. Yes, sir.
My name is Ravi Ranjan Singh. Well, I know your previous petition in UN. It is flawless. Second is, you have done so much on this. Well, we are talking of minorities in Pakistan.
Correct.
I'll like to add microscopic minorities. That is Jews, Zoroastrians, and Buddhists. Maybe 20 of them. The last synagogue, which was pulled down in 1998 by a government order. You see, all the places there are disputes or there are mobs that pull down a religious place. But in this case, there was no claimant, and there is no claimant yet to claim that it was a church or a mosque or anything, blah, blah. And lastly, it was converted into a mall because there was no taker. So what I suggest here is, that's a question as well as a suggestion, could we also include microscopic minorities? That's it.
Well, if you have some evidence, I don't mind including that. It's a minor thing.
Thank you, sir. Excellent presentation. One question. One of your slides, you said Islam does not permit any talk discussion, then what is the solution? Talk is not going to work.
See, that has massive implications for humanity. And the answer is still unknown. But I'm just reproducing what the gentleman said, that they seek validity only from within. And all they have to do is agree with themselves. So consequently, the logical corollary to this is that dialogue becomes impossible. If you read him, this is not my formulation. This is a formulation which is written by a Pakistani Muslim in a book which can be accessed by anyone. So it has massive implications. And it is going to keep countries occupied for the near future, I can tell you that much.
हेलो सर मैं हरियाणा से रहने वाला हूँ।
हाँ जी।
मेरे जैसे जो हैं ग्रैंड पेरेंट्स हैं सर, वो मुल्तान पंजाब से रहे हैं सर।
हाँ जी।
तो सर एक मुल्तान से एक जैसे व्यक्ति थे, ऑनलाइन से कई बार उनसे बात होती है तो वो उससे ये समझ में आता है कि सर वहाँ के लोग भी खुद चाहते हैं कि भारत में हम दोबारा मिल सके। तो सर मैं ये कहना चाहूँगा इस बात पे कि क्वेश्चन मेरा ये रहेगा कि गवर्नमेंट वहाँ की पाकिस्तान की जिम्मेदार है कि जो जेनोसाइड ऑफ हिंदू सिख्स एंड क्रिश्चियन के लिए, कि वहाँ के लोग भी जिम्मेदार हैं।
जैसे मैंने बोला, ये उनकी पूरी सभ्यता इसके अंदर रिस्पॉन्सिबल है। गवर्नमेंट जो सबके, जैसे मैंने बोला ना कि वो एक छोटी सी लड़की थी, वो किडनैप हो गई, पुलिस वहाँ पर गई और एक भी विटनेस नहीं मिला। तो उनकी पूरी सोसाइटी इसी के अंदर इसी काम में लगी हुई है, और इसी कारण से इतने वर्षों के बाद उनकी जो माइनॉरिटीज़ की जो आबादी का जो नंबर संख्या है इतना कम हो गया है। तो वो धार्मिक आधार पर जो स्टेट बनी थी और जिसका मैंने उल्लेख किया है, और जैसे वो हिंदुओं के विरुद्ध बनी थी, तो इसके कारण ये वही सोच उस देश में अभी तक बहुत ही शक्तिशाली है, और इसका कारण ये है कि ये हम परिणाम देख रहे हैं।